You.
What? Good show. Try.
Can the rest of you all hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, good, good. All right, we got tech support coming in now to help with one of these. Are you all able to see the red screen? Excellent. All right. Dan, let's go ahead and get started. We'll wait for Miss Nguyen. You can hear now? Okay, good. We'll wait for Miss Nguyen to join us if she does tonight. Hopefully she'll be staying here with us, staying in the class. All right, we have been speaking about Reconstruction in the United States. We're going to bring Reconstruction to an end. And then we're going to see how the nation's going to turn its eyes away from the South. It's basically going to say to the South, you know what? Fine, have your white supremacy, have your small minority in charge of politics, whatever. We've got other things to do. And in the process, they're going to turn and they're going to abandon a large portion of the population to the terror and violence and oppression of a small minority group. And it's not just blacks that they're going to abandon in this. It's also going to be poor whites as well. We'll get into that. But we bring forth the end of Reconstruction, which will be in 1877. And we're going to look at the new departure, and then we'll look at the election of 1872. And then the Mississippi Plan. Then we'll see the Compromise of 1877, which is technically where the course is supposed to begin, but I just can't do it without doing Reconstruction. And then we'll write the epitaph of Reconstruction. Now there is Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is the President of the United States from 1869 to 1877. He's a member of the Republican Party. He is, of course, the Civil War general who defeated Robert E. Lee in Virginia and brought about the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. He would ride to the White House on a wave of popularity. But he is not exactly considered to be one of the more dynamic presidents. He doesn't view his presidency as a mess of executive orders and so forth. It's more of he's a constitutionalist, he's a caretaker president, and only reluctantly does he actually will help the South, especially Southern Republicans, Southern African Americans, with federal troops only when absolutely necessary. So we look first at the new departure. Now, it was quite evident, even to some of the most diehard ex-Confederates, that the North had won the war and had been imposing their radical Reconstruction agenda on the South. And so there was a modicum, a small amount of, well, if we can't beat them, join them. Or at the very least, join them just enough to keep them, at bay, and we'll wait them out. Eventually, they'll get tired. They're going to want to go home. And so what the new departure is that this is the Southern Democrats, members of the Democratic Party in the South, decide to accept certain aspects of Reconstruction. Now, they're not going to start opening up restaurants and schools and having black kids and white kids right next to each other. We're not going this far yet. But what they do allow is they accept African American suffrage for the time. They say, all right, we'll go along with it. That's fine. And in doing this, by playing nice with the Northern Reconstruction government and with the federal government, some former Confederates get their voting rights returned. They get to hold public office. They get to get seats in the legislature. They get to have a role in Congress even. So what you're seeing is this gradual sort of, let's see if we can't get our foot in the door. And once we get our foot in the door, then we can blast it open and try and reassert white supremacy. Now, the ones that are the leaders of this new departure, the ones that, they are the ones that are seen as those who put their foot in the door and begin to reassert the old democratic white system in the South. They're called redeemers. You hear this a great deal in the South. They are Democrats who embraced the new departure. And embracing the new departure, they will take back political office in the South. They will make alliances with Republicans. They will allow certain African Americans to hold office or certain offices for African Americans. In many ways, they're compromisers. But their goal is really, let's get the foot in the door. One of the leaders of the Redeemers, one of the persons that is recognized as among the first Redeemers, is this fellow right here, William Mahone, who becomes senator from Virginia. Now, William Mahone was a Confederate general during the Civil War. And if you were to take a class in US 1 or the Civil War, he was at one of the most interesting battles of the Civil War. It's called the Battle of the Crater, in which the Union Pennsylvania Regiment packed several hundred tons of explosives underneath the Confederate lines and then blew up this big giant gap in the Confederate lines and could have rushed all the way to Richmond. Instead, they went into the middle of the crater, and Mahone and his guys recovered in time to start shooting down into this big giant pit, which is, by the way, still there today. Mahone becomes a senator from Virginia. William E. Cameron becomes the governor of Virginia. And they start calling themselves the Readjuster Party. And so they're a quasi-liberal wing of the Democratic Party, a less strident radical wing of the Republican Party. Excuse me. But implicit in this, and you can even see this beginning today with the current administration now beginning to take over and starting to put out executive orders and beginning to talk about legislation, you're starting to get pushback now from the Republican Party in the current Biden administration. Well, this is what the Redeemers are going to do, because they're not just simply going to go along in every way, shape, or form. They are going to attack the Republican administration. They're going to attack the Reconstruction governments. They're going to level, they're going to level a number of anti-Republican charges. They're going to say, for instance, this radical Reconstruction, this taxes that we're paying, it's unwelcome tax burdens on us. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? They're not really promoting enough business down here. They're more interested in punishing us. Even back then, there were people who said, if you ease the tax burden on the rich, that the rich will then spend the money and it'll begin to trickle down to the poor or the less fortunate. We know that that really doesn't work, but that was what they were saying. They also say that the Republican governments are corrupt. They are rife with corruption. Those carpetbaggers like Henry Clay Warmoth and others, they are mendacious, rapacious fools who steal money. These are people on the make. They're not really representing even the interests of our African-American population. Of course, that's not the term they use back then. So this is what's going on. You have members of the Democratic Party, they're making nice with the Republicans. They are achieving political office by getting their voting rights back. And then they start to, the whispering campaigns and open charges of corruption, and this is hurting business, and we're not really seeing much good going on here. When the truth was actually much different than that. Now, Grant has served one term as president of the United States. And as all presidents tend to want to do, they want to have a second term. That's considered tradition. You serve 2 terms in office. Most presidents, I would say, okay? Grant easily gets the nomination of his party for another term as president. The Democratic Party decides on a really interesting nomination. They choose not a politician, but a newspaper man who was actually a Republican. His name is Horace Greeley. And by looking at Horace Greeley, you can say this is a kind of a strange bird. And he really was a strange bird. He was the editor and founder of the New York Tribune, one of the largest newspapers in New York at the time. He was a dyed-in-the-wool abolitionist. He constantly wrote letters to Abraham Lincoln saying, you gotta liberate the slaves now. You're not doing enough for the cause of African Americans during the Civil War. And then afterwards, Greeley, showing what a complex human being he is, he writes letters to the government, to Andrew Johnson and others, to let Jefferson Davis out of jail. He tells America that this Reconstruction thing ain't working too well. It's time for us to get out of it altogether. So Greeley is a liberal Republican, and the Democrats say, well, let's just nominate him. And they knew quite well that he wasn't going to win. They simply didn't want to run one of their own, so they put up Greeley as a sacrificial lamb, so to speak. Now, Greeley thought that he was going to win. Greeley was absolutely convinced he was going to win this election. And he was helped along in this thought by the fact that people are charging corruption in the Grant administration. Now, it is often the case, many of the textbooks even say, Grant had corruption. No, not really. Grant didn't have that corrupted administration. Only one cabinet secretary resigned. He did have a series of scandals during his administration, but he wasn't responsible for them. It simply happened while he was president. Nonetheless, buck stops here, so to speak. It didn't do an ounce of good for Horace Greeley, and it didn't do an ounce of bad for Ulysses S. Grant, because Grant won in a landslide in this election. He carried 31 of 37 states. He won the popular vote more than 56 to 44. It was one of the largest popular vote margins in history. How disappointed was Horace Greeley? It literally broke his heart. He died on November the 29th, 1872, just a few days before they counted the electoral votes. And so many of the electors who were going to cast their votes, that is the casting of the ballot, not the counting, that took place in January, as we well know. Many of them decided to throw their support to other candidates. It's one of the few times in which electors will actually change who they're supposed to vote for in an election. Very much what the previous president wanted to see happen actually happened here. Guess what else was being talked about? Voter fraud. It's a great deal of voter fraud in 5 deep South states. See, back then you didn't have computers and automatic voting machines and hanging chads and all that kind of stuff. You filled out a ballot by hand, dropped it in the basket. And in states like, you guessed it, Louisiana and Arkansas and Texas and Mississippi and Alabama, there was a great deal of shenanigans going on. And in some of these states, the votes were actually thrown out. So don't think that voter fraud doesn't exist. Didn't exist in this last one, but it does happen from time to time. It especially happened back then. And wait till you see the election of 1876. That's going to really be a fun one. So U.S. Grant gets a second term as president. Now this shows you the electoral vote, and you see how the states cast their vote. Notice that Greeley, in the end, only gets 3 electoral votes, although he won 43% of more than 43% of the popular vote. But because he died, the electors just didn't give it to him, so they cast it for other people. But you see how Grant gets most of the votes. And this map is the county breakdown of the vote. This shows you how they voted by county, with Grant being in the red, Greeley in the blue. And you can see, look along the Mississippi Delta region, which is a heavily black settled area all the way to the mouth of the river. Look how either crimson or dark red this area is. Look at South Carolina, again, with a large black population. So Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, central Alabama, where you had large black populations or you had large Republican populations, you see the vote for Grant. For those of you that might be interested in following political races, like Steve Kornacki on MSNBC and what's his name? John, what's the guy on CNN? I forget. He's a good one too. All right, well, never mind. I'll figure it out after we get off of here. Now that you've had the new departure, at a certain point, the Democrats in the South are going to say, okay, we are not going to play nice anymore with the Republicans. We're going to end the alliance between the Southern Democrats and the Republicans. And this is going to become known as the Mississippi Plan. Because, of course, the great state of Mississippi leads the way. And what the Mississippi Plan is, very specifically, is political violence. Why they have a comma there, I don't know. So let's get that out of there real quick. Fix that. Okay. There's political violence to overthrow Reconstruction. They are literally going to do what you saw happen on January the 6th. That was a reenactment of the Mississippi Plan. There'll be terrorization of Black Republicans, getting your Klan group, getting whatever to ride around or through Black neighborhoods, towns, settlements, in order to make them stay home on election day. Lining up at courthouses and having to walk a gauntlet of people saying, I know who you are. It's a shame what's going to happen to your house if you cast that vote. Things like that. That's terror. That's political terror right there. It's designed to scare them away. And when terror doesn't work, then you use actual violence. You start killing. You start shooting. And in the proper manner, the proper Matt Gaetz matter or whatever, you blame it on them. In addition, they would use political and economic pressure on white Republicans in the South. Go after those scalawags. Or white Northern Republicans who move south. That's the carpetbaggers. Some examples of the Mississippi Plan in action. In 1874, a series of riots take place in the town of Vicksburg, Mississippi. A Black sheriff by the name of James Crosby is elected. Immediately, false information, false news of Black atrocities under the sheriff bring down whites from all around Vicksburg. They take over the town. They run rampant through the town. They run rampant through the state capitol also, Jackson, Mississippi. They throw things through the governor's window. President Grant is not exactly sanguine about sending troops into Mississippi because he feels he's got political considerations. He thinks that the Democrats are going to win Ohio if he does this in state elections. So he's got a political calculation. Finally, he brings troops in. They put James Crosby back in as sheriff, and 3 months later, James Crosby is murdered, shot in the streets. The ones that carried on this political violence, they carried it in the open. They're not like the Klan. The Klan does it in secret. The Klan is, the shadow organization. The red shirts, on the other hand, white paramilitary organizations, they do it in public. And they are well known for their red shirts. What does that red shirt look like? You ever watch Ole Miss play football?
Oh, I was gonna say like the redcoats from like England or whatever.
That's what the Ole Miss uniform is designed on. How about that? Now, Mississippi's not the only one to get into the action. There's other places in other states. Let's look at the state of Louisiana, for instance. On April the 13th and 14th, 1873, there's a riot in Colfax, Louisiana. I already talked about the Colfax riot. That's the Mississippi Plan being worked out. Y'all know that some monuments came down in New Orleans the last couple of years? Well, we got rid of a statue of Jefferson Davis. We took Robert E. Lee off of his high pedestal. We took Beauregard off of his horse. And what else came down? Does anybody else remember what came down in the city? One other important thing came down. No. There was a battle down at the foot of Canal Street called the Battle of Liberty Square on September the 8th, 1874, in which a white mob calling themselves the White League went down to disrupt an election, and the Metropolitan Police, which was consisting of blacks and whites, was fought. There were several people killed, and the U.S. Army had to be brought into New Orleans to restore order. And the commander of the Army at the time, of that division that was brought in, was James Longstreet, who was an ex-Confederate, who had, asserted his loyalty back to the Union. He was a good friend of Ulysses S. Grant. So what did the White League do? They erected this monument at the foot of Canal Street called the Liberty Monument. It was a big Egyptian-looking obelisk to memorialize what? The whites that died on that day, the members of the White League. And then they enshrined the names of the leaders on there just to say, we're the leaders that restored white rule to New Orleans. That monument sat down there on the foot of Canal Street by the ferry until the 1980s. And then they decided they wanted to move it and put it away and take it down. And whenever you take down any sort of white monument, you know that David Duke and his goons are going to show up. And they started protesting and saying, no, this is hurting our quote unquote white heritage. And the Reverend Avery Alexander showed up and he had to be dragged away by the police. Meanwhile, Duke and the boys were let alone. I don't know why that. Then they came up with a compromise. They moved it to the flood wall where you drive into the Canal Place to go to the old theater that was there. And so it was there up until the Charleston shooting. And then Mayor Landry brought them all down. And now it's been put into a museum somewhere, or into a storage shed, and they're trying to figure out where to put all these statues. Right here in New Orleans. What eventually happens is that Mississippi will write a constitution in 1890 in which they will disenfranchise and disarm African Americans to end election violence. So they'll actually take, it's the conservatives that'll take the guns away. They'll take the guns away from African Americans. Now, the Constitution itself, those constitutions never say anything about race. What they do is they use things like poll taxes, having to pay in order to vote, literacy tests that are administered subjectively. Oh, I'm going to administer this person who's black a literacy test. This good old boy who's white, I know he can read and write, let him in. When it was actually probably the reverse. Or they would find all sort of other stratagems. But when you read the minutes of those constitutional conventions, you hear them very plainly say, there's no coded language here. It's very open. We want to maintain white vote and keep blacks from voting. Period. End of story. It's part of the public record. And all any person has to do is go look it up in the archives and you get to see it. And this is how Jim Crow begins to make its march into the South. It starts with things like the New Departure and the Mississippi Plan. And it comes to its full fruition in the Compromise of 1877. Okay, so we have the presidential election of 1876. The Republicans choose Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, Civil War officer, rather man of mediocre talent and means, but a good party apparatchik. The Democrats once again tagged the governor of New York, Samuel L. Tilden. The Democratic Party has put its act back together since the Civil War. It's in a much better situation since the Civil War. Tilden wins the popular vote. He beat Hayes by about 250,000 votes. But he did not win the electoral vote. When the votes were counted, it was going to be 184 to 165 in favor of Tilden, but you needed 185 votes to get the nomination. And there were still 20 votes sitting out there from Florida, because Florida can never count its votes properly in an election, South Carolina, and you guessed it, Louisiana. So you had 20 votes out there. Tilden only needed one vote, just one vote, and he would have been the president of the United States. Hayes needed all 20 votes. Now, both sides claimed election fraud. And there was a lot of skullduggery going on. There was a lot of things going on. And because of the election fraud that was going on, both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, said, we get the 20 votes. 4 from Florida, 8 from Louisiana, 7 from South Carolina, and 1 from the state of Oregon. If he had just gotten Oregon, he'd have won. And so what you have is a constitutional crisis. The Democrats are yelling, Tilden or blood. Congressman Henry Watterson of Kentucky openly declared that an army of 100,000 men were going to march on Washington unless Tilden was declared the president. And the Civil War had only been 12 years ago. Those kind of threats were taken rather seriously. And so they put together an electoral commission. The House and the Senate decided to put together a commission, very much like what some of the Republicans just recently were asking for in the wake of the 2020 election, that they had to be a commission to examine the baseless charges of voter fraud. There wasn't baseless back then, though. It would be a bipartisan commission. And since the Republicans were in the majority, it would be 8-7 in favor of the Republicans. You'd have 5 members from the House, 5 members from the Senate, and 5 justices from the Supreme Court. One of the members of this commission was a Republican from Ohio by the name of James Abram Garfield, who himself would be the future president of the United States, although not for a long time. The tribunal begins hearing the arguments. The Democrats want everything investigated. The Republicans say, no, you don't investigate the states. The states are sovereign. You're violating state sovereignty if you do that. This is a violation of federalism. This is a violation of the constitutional order. And so the commission voted 8-7 along party lines, Republicans 8, Democrats 7, to give Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency of the United States. And thus Rutherford B. Hayes became the second president of the United States to be elected president without getting the majority of votes in the popular vote. The first one was John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson. Now the Democrats are going to start screaming holy hell again. But a couple of congressmen go off on the side and they say, look, everything is about compromise here. And we're going to get the presidency, but we're going to give you something even more important than that. The Democrats are like, well, what are you going to give us more important than that? So it's an informal, there's nothing written down about it. It is a simple agreement. The presidency will go to Hayes and you will smile and you will say, okay, he's the president, we'll let him take the oath. And Hayes is going to remove all federal troops from the South. We're sending the boys home. That's it. That's the compromise. Nothing signed. It was a gentleman's handshake agreement. And with that gentleman's handshake agreement, nearly 4.5 million African Americans were now left to the mercy of the state governments. Ten years after this, federal government passes the Electoral Count Act of 1887 to prevent sort of things like this from ever happening again. And that the governor of each state, this is the federal government says that the governor of each state certifies the election, period, end of story. Which is one of the reasons why the former president was on the phone with Donald Trump and with the governor of Georgia and the secretary of state, calling people up saying, don't certify that vote, don't certify that vote. But once it's certified by the states, this is how America works its election. It's arcane, I agree. But this is federalism at its finest. And so Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the president of the United States. And the Democrats go around calling him Rutherfraud B. Hayes, his fraudulency. Samuel Tilden, really bitter about it, but he accepts it. He understands how compromises work. So there you see the electoral vote breakdown of each state. And thus, with troops being pulled out of the South, the Democratic Party, which had been the primary party in the South, the dominant party in the South, at one time the only party in the South, now reasserts its dominance in the South. They begin to take over the legislatures. They reduce any sort of black office holding to bare minimum. They use fraud and violence in their elections. And eventually you're going to see the resurgence of white supremacy, Jim Crow. Now keep in mind something. The federal government is spending a great deal of money in Reconstruction, and now it's not doing it anymore. And the Civil Rights Acts are still in effect, and the South needs to find ways to go around the Civil Rights Act. And so what happens is that government in the South is geared for one thing and one thing only, white supremacy. But in order to have a government based in white supremacy, you can't have much else. Because then the federal government says, oh, no, we're not going to allow that. And so what happens is that you see a reduction in government services and funding. The North, who's gotten tired of Reconstruction in the South, basically says, fine, you want your white supremacy? You got it. Enjoy it. And that's all you're going to have. You're not going to have nice new roads. You're not going to have infrastructure. You're not going to have bridges built. You're not going to have railroads coming down the South like you want. No, you'll have your white supremacy. To which many of the white elites said, that's fine. That's how important white supremacy was to them. And what happens is that the South becomes a backwater. What I call it the concreted swimming pool. Y'all know the principle of the concreted swimming pool? There's a public swimming pool, right? Whites only. Only whites are allowed to swim in the swimming pool. African Americans then say, wait a minute, civil rights, equality, this is public money, public funds. We want to integrate the swimming pool. No. They're going to fight it tooth and nail. They're going to go through the courts. They're going to waste a whole lot of state tax dollars on this, right? Fighting it in the courts. And finally, the court says, you have to integrate the swimming pool. All right, we got to integrate. That's what the law says. What does the town do? They suddenly declare, we can't afford the swimming pool anymore. Let's pour concrete into it and close it. Nobody gets the swimming pool. You say, how does this happen? You can go look in the front of City Park, right where you go in on Marconi and Orleans Avenue and go into where the rides are and everything. Used to be a big, giant public swimming pool there. And in the 1960s, the pool was integrated and Mayor Skiro turned it into a monkey pool, basically. He put monkeys in there and let the pool fall apart. That's what I call the concreted swimming pool effect. And that's what happens. Oh, we got to have integrated services and we'll have no services at all, which means that the rich and the elites and the wealthy, they can have stuff like that, but nobody else can. And so this leaves out African Americans. It also leaves out poor whites. At the turn of the century, a professor of history at Columbia University in New York by the name of William Archibald Dunning writes what is considered by many whites to be the seminal work on Reconstruction. His name is Dunning, like I said, Dunning School. Now, what's happening at the turn of the century? Most of the Civil War veterans have died off by this point. There's a few still alive, true, but they're in their, well into their advanced years. The next generation has come on. There's a great deal of resurgence of white supremacy. You've had the Plessy v. Ferguson, the reinstitution of Jim Crow. You have the Lost Cause, which said, oh, the Civil War was actually a very good thing, for the Confederacy, and they were noble knights and all that. And you also had academics like William Dunning saying, yeah, it was, I'm going to buy into that. And so the Dunning School is the popular belief that all Reconstruction officials were corrupt. The Freedmen's Bureau was rampant with corruption. Carpetbag rule in the South was rampant with corruption. You had rule by bayonet when they didn't have hardly enough troops in the South to rule by bayonet. Ulysses S. Grant was a failed president. When he actually wasn't that bad of a president. He wasn't one of the top 5, I'll give you that. But he's in the top half, not according to Dunning. And this created a terrible problem in the South and caused the South all sorts of problems. And these white redeemers rescued the South, redeemed the South from blacks and carpetbaggers. He had a book that came out called The Klansman. He actually spells it with a C, The Klansman. Later in 1915, it get turned into a movie, Birth of a Nation. Shows that African Americans were just rapacious as leaders and shiftless and lazy and just out for themselves. Pure propaganda, absolute pure propaganda. And it's up to those like W.B. Du Bois to set the record straight and write Black Reconstruction, show the good that Reconstruction did, but nobody's listening. At least nobody who's white is really listening. And the legacy of this is African Americans begin to look outside the South and begin to start saying, you know what, enough. We've had it. It's time to move elsewhere. We've got to have better opportunities than this. We've got to have more dignity than this. And we'll come to that. That's going to be in the 1910s and 20s. You'll see what happens. Any questions on that? Now, like I've said, most historians will tell you Reconstruction has not come to an end. But this political reconstruction of the post-Civil War period certainly has come to an end. The social reconstruction of bringing African Americans and whites together, at least in government, has come to an end. And now we're going to see the South pull back into a backwater of white supremacy and quote unquote cherish traditions. And what is the North doing at this time? Well, the North has basically said, enough. We've got other things to pursue. We fought the war, we saved the Union, we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we passed the civil rights laws. You know what? There's nothing more we can do. Now it's up to people. The hearts and minds will just have to, come when they come. The North is going to turn itself toward industrialization. And so we're going to see the foundations of industrialization. We'll see rivers of steel, and captains of industry, labor and industry. We'll see the age of spoils and unrest in politics, and then we'll see U.S. foreign policy in this age as well. Now, when you think about industrialization in places like Louisiana, you think about breweries. And there's the old Dixie Brewery, which now has changed its name. I think it's going to call itself Faubourg Beer. Is that the new name for Dixie beer? Well, that's the old brewery on Tulane Avenue, which has now been retrofitted into the VA. It's like an entrance pavilion to the VA. And the old loading dock to the left in white that you see there, that's been torn down. But breweries are an important aspect of industrialization. This country is going to industrialize not on a geometric scale, but instead an exponential scale. How industrialized will we become? I'm going to repeat this later on in another lesson. The city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my wife's hometown. And she's over to my right, pumping her fist right now. Yay, Pittsburgh. Although the poor Steelers didn't get to play the Saints in the Super Bowl. But let's go back to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh will produce more refined steel during World War II than Germany, Italy, and Russia combined. Now, let me make sure you understand. One city, a little city, not a big city, a little city on the Monongahela and Allegheny Rivers, and its steel mills will produce more refined steel than Germany, Italy, and Russia combined. That's just how industrialized we had become. And what's the foundation of industrialization? If you want to know why we industrialized so much, you have to look first and foremost at Northern Reconstruction. Yes, the South went through Reconstruction. It was rebuilt. But there was rebuilding in the North too, even though the North was not affected physically by the war. But industry was affected by the war. Now, up to this point, we do have the Industrial Revolution that's been happening. You do have mass industrialization, but when you talk about factories and so forth in America prior to the Civil War, you're talking about places that had 20, 30 workers at the most. But now you have the Civil War come along and you have to produce refined steel and pig iron and weapons and gear of war. And you do it on a mass scale. And you do it on such a mass scale, you say to yourself, well, look, if I can make bullets and cannons and ships for war, well, can I do that with thingamabobs and doohickeys and widgets and so forth? Consumer items. The answer is yes. And so that's what the North finds out. Hey, we can do it during wartime. We'll do it during peacetime, but we'll make peacetime goods, not war goods. So what, in the end, makes America great in the sense of industrialization? Well, the Northern Reconstruction is the primal reason, but you also have a whole bunch of other things as well. For instance, entrepreneurial spirit. America is a nation of inventors, either inventing machines or coming up with ideas about business. Secondly, we have an abundance of mineral resources, most notably coal. Well, it's not clean, but we got a lot of it. That's anthracite coal, not the coal you put into your barbecue pit. That's charcoal. Anthracite, good, hard, solid coal, kind of halfway on its way to becoming a diamond. It'll burn hot. It will help you turn iron into steel. We have copper, we have silver, we have gold. Anybody know what molybdenum is? I know my wife does. She's a science teacher. We produce more molybdenum and vanadium than any country on earth. We have copper mines at the wazoo. I mean, this country is an absolute treasure chest of mineral resources. This country also had a long tradition of interchangeable parts. And when you have interchangeable parts, it means you can have mass industrialization. You can take one part out of one widget and put it into another widget. The Civil War cost a lot of money, but those who invested wisely in the Civil War, who bought the bonds and so forth, the big bond buyers made money off of the Civil War. And so you have an abundance of capital. You have many banks that want to make more money. They want to loan it out at a good interest, not a terrible interest. This country is still very much moving west. We passed the Homestead Act. During the Civil War, we are actually passing legislation to give people land, because there are still plenty of people in this country that believe the foundation of this country is to get people their own land, and that's out in the West. We have a protective tariff. I will say this numerous times throughout the class. A tariff is simply the tax on an imported good. Let's say, for instance, I hold up, I don't know if you can see, oh, here we go, this green pen. All right, now this green pen is made in the United States, and it's $7. All right, well, let's see, all right, $7. And I got this green pen, and this is made in France, and it's $5. Obviously, I want to buy the one that is $5, right? So what does the tariff do? The tariff says, oh, we're going to put $3 tax on each pen coming in from France. So now it costs $8 to get this pen, and get it in front of me so you can see it, this pen from France, and it's $7 to get the one in the United States. There you go. That's what a tariff does. That's about as simple as I can be with it. It protects American manufacturing. Now, of course, tariffs are a double-edged sword, because if you put too much of a tariff on a country's good, the country's going to turn and say, whoa, you want to do that to us? Well, fine. You need something from us that we got. I mean, well, no, you want to sell us your goods? Well, we'll put a tax on your goods. And then you get a trade war, like what we've been doing with China for a long, long time. And I'm so glad not to hear a president say China anymore. We also had railroad land grants. You had the Pacific Railway Act was passed. This country is building the Transcontinental Railroad. It is selling land to people so that they can put the railroads down. But there is one last thing that needs to be done. And that is, many of the states say we want to participate in this industrial revolution. We want to participate in mass industrialization. But you know what we don't have? We don't have the schools for that sort of thing. Oh, we got great universities. We've got Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Princeton and Dartmouth. We got Ole Miss and the University of Michigan. And we got, all these places. But what we need are universities that are going to train people in how to participate in the Industrial Revolution. We need schools that will teach engineering, mechanics, agriculturalists. That's what we really need. And so what the federal government does is it passes a law called the Land Grant College Act of 1862. Since it was sponsored by a representative named William Morrill, it's often called the Morrill Act. And what the Land Grant College Act does is it produces or creates agricultural and mechanical schools, A&Ms. Many of the universities of the country to this point are located in or around urban centers. But in order to have a mechanical or an agricultural school, you need to have space. And so what they do is they'll put these in small towns rather than near the big cities. And so you have, for instance, Mississippi State University, which is really the technical school. I mean, it's a full four-year university now that has all the liberal arts as well. But initially, it's established as an agricultural mechanical school or an agricultural and technical school. And so you have Mississippi State, Oklahoma State, the tower there, Michigan State. See how you see Michigan and then Michigan State when you're watching college football and all that kind of stuff? North Carolina A&T, Texas A&M, Giga Maggies. Those are the schools that are created by the Land Grant College Act. LSU gets into the action. The official name of LSU is not just LSU, it's LSU A&M. And you say, well, that's in a big city, Baton Rouge. No, not at the time LSU got the land grant. Baton Rouge was a little podunk town. And LSU was several miles down the river from Baton Rouge. Now Baton Rouge has grown up around it, yes. But so you notice all these schools in the SEC. Baton Rouge, Tuscaloosa, Auburn, Athens, Georgia. There you go. Gainesville, Florida. Those aren't big metropolises. Well, they weren't big metropolises when the schools were founded, and they were designed. Now, many of them started out as A&Ms, but then they changed it to state universities. So you have North Carolina State, but they were all A&Ms. You just didn't want to have the sort of the, I don't know, the opprobrium or the people make fun of them. Whereas, Texas A&M, they sort of embrace that agginess. Not many other schools do that anymore. So many of the state universities were, A&Ts or A&Ms before that. Most of these schools are white schools. African Americans say, what about us? And so a second act in 1890 is aimed at the South and aimed for African Americans. Grambling, Southern, Florida A&M, go Rattlers, North Carolina A&T. A variety of other African-American schools are created this way. And it's designed simply to train people to take part in the mass industrial movement that's going on in the country. Wow, I've already gone an hour into class. I can't believe that. Okay, I like to talk, don't I? What is the hallmark of mass industrialization in the 1870s and 80s and 90s? What industry really emerges front and center more than any other industry at the time? And I'm asking the question, so I want you to answer it for me. Take a guess. It's okay to be wrong.
Iron.
Say again.
Iron.
Iron. You're actually very close. It's an iron-related industry. It's an industry that really depends on iron and steel. How's that for a hint?
Is it railroads?
Railroads, yes, railroads. Railroad expansion. Oh, Nelly. The post-Civil War era is going to see railroads balloon in this country, especially in the wake of the Transcontinental Railroad. One of the reasons why railroad expansion is allowed or is able to grow is that the federal government mandated that railroads have a standard gauge. Does anybody know what gauge is? Yeah, there you go, Ms. Fisher. It's the width of the tracks. See, each railroad, in order to keep the other railroad from taking it over, would vary the width of its tracks. Well, the federal government says, ain't nobody got time for all that, okay? Enough. One standard gauge. And so when you go around the country, the railroad gauge in Albuquerque, New Mexico is the same as in Ann Arbor, Michigan, is the same as in Athens, Georgia, and so forth. Which means that the smaller railroads now have to start competing with each other and can start merging or taking over. And remember, with a railroad, this is the pinnacle of business because, as Ponson pointed out, steel, iron, coal, lumber, land, all of this comes together. So the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 is designed to create the Transcontinental Railroad. Down in Africa, Cecil Rhodes, after whom Rhodesia was named, was building a transcontinental railroad in Africa that was going to go from Cairo all the way to Cape Town, South Africa, and was going to go through some of the nastiest jungle in the world. Go watch The Ghost in the Darkness and you'll understand that. Well, that's the Victorian age, and America wants to do it too. We're going to link the country with the Transcontinental Railroad. It's going to show that we have that can-do spirit. It'll show that America is great. And the railroads become the model for big business. What is the most important device that a railroad must have? Anybody want to hazard a guess? What's the most important device on any railroad?
The train.
What?
The train.
No, there's something even more important than the train itself. Although it's good to have a working train, yeah.
The people, you need a person.
The clock.
Oh.
The clock. That's the key. Most important piece of equipment in a railroad business is the clock, a schedule. When you're going to pull into the station, when you're not. To be on schedule is everything because that allows you to pick up cargo, drop it off. And when you can keep your clock, you can have good business. So railroads become the model for big business, which is determined by the clock. As I said, with the conversion to standard gauge, now you start to see intense competition. And one of the leaders of this is a fellow by the name of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who runs the New York Central Railroad. Cornelius Vanderbilt grew up in New York on Staten Island, and he helped his father with a ferry from Staten Island to Manhattan, and then begins to make money and invested, and he gets his own steamship company. He operates a ferry from New York to Philadelphia, makes even more money, and then he gets into railroads. And he was one tough customer when it came to railroads. But he made a ton of money in railroads. And because he had been a steamship captain, he got a nickname. Anybody know the nickname? Think about his name, his last name. He was known as the Commodore, just like the university's mascot, the Commodores of Vanderbilt. One of Vanderbilt's great rivals is Jay Gould, who loved to poke fun at Vanderbilt in public and get Vanderbilt all pissed off. When Vanderbilt made so much money near the end of his life, he gave $1 million to establish Vanderbilt University, and that's why it bears his name, and that's why they call the Commodores. Another one, Mark Hopkins Jr., also ran railroads. And sometimes the armed conflict, there's the old Commodore there. Should have had him up higher in the, you take one look at him, he was a tough customer. His younger son committed suicide because he could never live up to his father's expectations. In the Old West, railroad competition erupted in violence. People would fight over railroad lines. And after all, it's the Old West. And we will get to the Old West, I hope, before the end of tonight. But the real centerpiece of the railroad world is Chicago. Chicago becomes the place for railroads. It was, after all, the terminus, the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, other cities had been thought of as a terminus for the Transcontinental Railroad. St. Louis was one. New Orleans was actually one. It's one of the reasons why Jefferson Davis bought the lower part of Arizona, called the Gadsden Purchase, when he was Secretary of War, because they wanted to put a Transcontinental Railroad through the South. But it gets to be Chicago. Chicago is an ideally located city when it comes to the railroads. It's on the Great Lakes. Being on the Great Lakes means that it is an Atlantic port. It has access to the Atlantic Ocean. But it's also in the geographic center of or near the geographic center of the country, which means that Chicago has access to the Great Plains and all the crops and all the livestock that are going to come through there. And so as a result of this, and the result of the fact that Chicago is the centerpiece of the railroad world, it becomes a center for mail order sales. Long before you had Amazon, you had mail order sales. When you wanted something, you simply opened up the catalog, found it, and you put the money in an envelope and or the money order and sent it on. And it was mailed to you, not by drone, by carrier. And because of Chicago's proximity to the Great Plains, it becomes the center of meatpacking. Chicago comes to be known as Hog Butcher of the World, as Carl Sandburg calls it, the city of the big shoulders. And it's one of the reasons why I have you reading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, because it's about Chicago and the meatpacking industry, which is also big industry. Now, Chicago is the eastern terminus for the meatpacking, where the western terminus is. You'll see cities like, or towns like Abilene, Dodge City in Kansas. That'll be the great railheads where you drive the cattle and the hogs there, load them up on the cars and send them to Chicago, where they're then slaughtered, packed, and sent out so that you can have a nice prime rib for dinner. Or a mystery meat surprise in a school cafeteria. Ugh. That's important. Chicago is the place. Those are the Union stockyards in Chicago around the 1950s. I mean, this is vast extent. This is down on the south side of Chicago. This is where Upton Sinclair would have, done his expose on the meatpacking industry. And of course, the one thing that told you were near the stockyards was the smell. With this mass industrialization going on in the country, you had those who profited the most from it. The ones that had the entrepreneurial spirit, the ones that took advantage of the circumstances, took advantage of the regulations or lack of regulations in the government, the ones that had the most ruthlessness, the killer instinct in business, those that knew how to make a deal. We call them captains of industry, or we could also call them robber barons, because many people said that their profits were ill-gotten, achieved at a great deal of shenanigans and tomfoolery and so forth. And they did not really take care of their workers as well as many thought. But understand the context in which these people live, these men live. These are white men. Let's not forget that. And the context is, at the time, there is a thing called social Darwinism. Now, Darwin never said the term survival of the fittest. He never wrote that in any of his things. He had the theory of natural selection, but that doesn't equate to survival of the fittest. A British economist by the name of Herbert Spencer, he coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And what he does is he applies what he thinks are the principles of Darwinism to business. The strong and the large survive, and the small and the weak are either destroyed or assumed into the larger industry. It is the principle on which business still to this day follows. And it is based in large part on the writings of a British economist who had absolutely no idea what business was really all about, because he was a wonk that lived in a university office most of his life, by the name of Adam Smith. And he came up with what was known as laissez-faire economics. And laissez-faire economics says for government to get out the way. Let businesses handle their business. If things get out of hand, businesses will then turn and correct it. The market will take care of these things. That invisible hand of the market, people like to say. And this was the way in which businesses operate. They told governments, stay out of the way. And not only did they tell governments to stay out of the way, they made it so that governments would stay out of the way. They put their people in government. They put their people on the Supreme Court. And so the US government during this time essentially said, well, we'll let business do its thing and we'll do our thing, which is not a whole lot. And so now the captains of industry begin to exert themselves. The first and foremost of these is a Scotsman by the name of Andrew Carnegie. Comes to this country with probably less than $50 total. And he gets into the steel industry. And he helps create US Steel. Now, for those that don't know me too well, and I'm sure that's all of you at this point, one of my favorite movies is The Godfather, the whole trilogy, really, not just the first and second one, although the third one's a little weak. In the second Godfather movie, The Godfather Part 2, the mobster Hyman Roth tells Michael Corleone and there's all of his people, gentlemen, we're bigger than US Steel. That's saying how big you are. That meant you were really, really big. And so, because of US Steel, Carnegie is able to amass a great deal of wealth. And like many of the captains of industry, they spend the money on themselves. They build themselves magnificent homes, palaces. But there's a little thing in the back of their consciences that's eating away at them. They know what they've done is not exactly kosher. And they are very familiar with the scripture passage of the man who was very wealthy and then died and couldn't take it with him. So what do? Near the end of their lives, they start giving as much money away as possible. They start engaging in what is known as philanthropy, what others call the gospel of wealth. To those whom much wealth has been given, much is expected. Sounds like responsibility, right? Great power comes great responsibility. And so what does Carnegie do? He endows museums, libraries, music halls, universities. He's establishing as many things in his name as possible. Notice how Tom and Gail Benson, the late owner of the Saints, and Miss Gail, they got their name on all sorts of things throughout this community because Benson made excuse my French, a shit ton of money with the Saints and with his car dealerships. What do? They start spreading it out, start investing it, or they start donating it. They have massive art collections. They put that on display. Some of them had jewel collections. Now, going back to Carnegie's business model, there are two types of business models in major business. One is called vertical integration. The other is called horizontal integration. Carnegie followed what is known as vertical integration. Now, vertical integration means that you own or control all aspects of your business. If you want to be in the steel, you need to have coal, right? So Carnegie would have his own coal mines. He had his own steel refineries. He controlled every aspect of that. A good example of vertical integration today is McDonald's, right? McDonald's makes its own containers, makes its own cups, the whole deal. It is in the real estate as well. That's how McDonald's really became a major corporation, through real estate. The mom and pop hamburger shop, right? They buy their hamburgers from one particular area. They buy their fries from another business. They buy their containers from Cisco. All these sort. That's the horizontal style of integration, which we'll get to in a moment. Carnegie is vertical integration. You control all aspects, all businesses that produce or contribute to your production. And by the way, I'm not an economist. I do not purport to be an economist. That is the best explanation I can give, and there are plenty of other professors who can do a hell of a better job than I just did. Now, in captains of industry, you had the entrepreneurial spirit and the drive to create businesses. You had others that they knew a good thing when they saw it and they wanted to invest in it. These are the men with the money. And the foremost man with the money is this fellow right here, John Pierpont Morgan. You hear the company names, Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Morgan and Company, and so forth. Now that's him. There's a picture of him. He had an awful case of rosacea on his nose, and it made his nose incredibly bulbous. That picture right there was photoshopped by Morgan on Morgan's orders. That nose he's got there was much uglier than that. It was painted over. But Morgan's the money guy. He's the financier. He's the guy you went to when you had an idea and you wanted to do the business. Or you went to him and say, look, my business is struggling. I need a cash infusion. Can you help me out? Morgan says, let me see your business plan. Let me see your business model. Put it in front of me. I want to know what I'm investing myself in right now. And he did that. He says, okay, I am going to help you out because I think you're a company worth saving. But there's a catch. And of course, when you lend out money, there's always a catch. And the catch is very simple. You're putting me on your board. I'm going to help you reorganize your business. I'm going to get a 50% plus one share in the profits of your company. This is called Morganization. It will come up. Yes, there it is. So that's Morgan putting his money into companies to start them up or to save them, but getting himself on the board. As a result of this, he was on the board or owned 34 major industries. 24 of them were railroads. He was also well known for being a guy who, when he socialized, he drank ginger ale. He didn't drink, but he drank ginger ale to give the appearance that he was drinking while the other people were getting drunk. J.P. Morgan didn't call upon U.S. presidents when he needed something. U.S. presidents called on J.P. Morgan when they needed something. This was one of the most powerful men in America. While he was vacationing in France, he decided that he was going to stay an extra 2 days in France and that he was going to miss his connection to the United States on a ship that was named the Titanic, in which he had a strong investment in. He lost a hell of a lot of money with the Titanic, but he publicly said, doesn't matter, it's the loss of life that really shook him. The third of the big three that I'm going to concentrate on is John Davis and Rockefeller. Rockefeller's industry, whereas Carnegie was steel and Morgan was finance, Rockefeller was oil. He created Standard Oil. And you see the gas stations of Standard Oil to this day. Anybody know a Standard Oil gas station, what it's called now? Well, Standard Oil had the initials SO, right? So for a while it was called ESSO, ESSO. And they changed it, Exxon. That's Standard Oil. Now, in the oil business, of which Rockefeller was growing and growing and getting bigger and bigger, he employed what is known as horizontal integration. In horizontal integration, that's like the mom and pop hamburger store. You get, you contract with other companies to provide you with the necessities, and the same in the oil industry. Which is why when you drive along Highway 90 in Lafayette and the industrial parts and all, you see pipe fitters, people that sheet metal, pipe, and all that all these things. Instead of him owning all the things that go into oil drilling and oil production, instead he contracts it out. That's horizontal integration. Now, Morgan is the real good one at this. But what they do is they create companies called a holding company. And this holding company will actually administer several other companies below it. Its job is to administer the companies below it. These become known as trusts. And trusts got very, very large. How large do they get? They get so large and they get so powerful that many politicians begin to fear them. Average Americans begin to fear them because they have so much power, they have so much wealth. They're using that power and their wealth in politics. Rockefeller was a big player in politics. In fact, his grandson would become governor of New York and vice president of the United States, Nelson Rockefeller. So these trusts are getting very big. And after a while, people say they're too big. We need to break them up. They're called trust busters. And no greater a trust buster existed than one Theodore Roosevelt, who would become president of the United States. That was his big domestic reform agenda, was to break up the trusts. And that's why eventually you would have things like Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of Louisiana, Standard Oil of Pennsylvania, and so forth. You'd break it up. And you had a variety of other big trusts as well. The railroads, those were huge trusts. And it showed what? The trust showed how wealth was being concentrated near the top. It was being used in politics to a very sort of creating an advantage that was far and above anything that any small-time operative could take. And many people said, this is un-American. Because of his bulbous nose, Morgan did not like to have his picture taken at all. And you see him going after a cameraman who had basically done the iPhone with a camera at the time and caught him. And Morgan went after the guy. It was not a happy camper when he was photographed without his permission. As I said, you have the entrepreneurial spirit. You have the financiers, okay, the guys who know how to create the business, the guys who know how to finance the business. But you also need to have somebody that thinks about making things or creating things, inventors. Anybody know who that young boy is? At the age of 11, he started his own business selling concessions on a train. And one day he was late for the train and he ran and jumped at the train. The conductor caught him by the ears and pulled him aboard. But in doing so, it deprived him of his hearing in his left ear. But he didn't miss work that day. He's one of the greatest inventors we've ever had. Does that give you a clue?
Albert Einstein?
Yeah, no, that's not Einstein. Einstein grew up in Germany. He was known as the Wizard of Menlo Park.
I know that.
His name is Thomas Alva Edison, the inventor of the electric light bulb. Edison was the consummate scientist. Menlo Park was his laboratory in New Jersey. This is where the electric light was created. And just to show you what his mindset was like, while they were trying to create an incandescent bulb, they had gone through 200 materials trying to find what would make a good filament for a light. And after the 200th, his assistant threw up his hands and he says, I'm so tired. We haven't learned anything. And Edison said, oh no, you're so wrong. We've learned a lot today. What do you mean we've learned a lot today? We now know 200 things that won't make a good light bulb. That's how he thought. Eventually, he created a light bulb with a carbon filament. And with that, the darkness was chased. Edison had more than 1,000 patents on invention. Most of his inventions dealt with the electric telegraph. The light was his crowning achievement, but his bread and butter was the telegraph. He had 1,000 patents on invention. He had a mandate. I want one invention every month. He damn near got it his lifetime. He then goes to J.P. Morgan. He says, I got this great idea. Let's create a company that will bring light to everybody. And they do it. What's the name of the company? You know it. Everybody knows it. They bring good things to light. That's their motto.
Is it energy?
General Electric, GE.
GE, General Electric, yes.
GE.
He helped form General Electric. Now, most of the power companies in the Northeast, Con Edison, Connecticut Edison, New York Edison, and so forth. and GE becomes one of the big giant trusts. You had the department stores. See, in those days, when you wanted shoes, you went to the shoe store. When you wanted a dress, you went to the dressmaker. When you wanted an appliance or something, you went to the appliance place. Not that you had washing machines like that back then, but you know what I'm saying. You went to a specialized shop. Well, then all of a sudden, several guys got together and said, you know, it would be great if we had one place where everybody could come together and they can get whatever they want. Boys' clothes, girls' clothes, women's clothes, men's clothes, appliances, furniture, you name it. Hence the department store. In New York, you had Macy's and Gimbel's. In Philadelphia, you had Wanamaker's. Chicago, you had Marshall Fields. New Orleans, you had your departmental stores. Maison Blanche.
DH Homes.
What's that?
I said DH Homes.
Yeah, or as we like to call it, Holmes's. Kraus, Gus Meyer, Gotchaw's. Ain't there no more, right? And when you went into these department stores, I mean, you were hit with consumerism. And when you walk into a department store today, you go to Lakeside, you walk into Dillard's, or you walk into JC. Is JC Penney still out there? I don't go to the mall anymore. So. You walk into a department store, what's the first thing that's going to hit you when you walk into that department store? Maybe it's still the case.
Clothes now.
Clothes. All right. What else? What else attracts your senses? Any smells?
The perfume department.
Yeah, cosmetics, right? That's by design, ladies. It's very attractive to women. Okay, they want you walking in there, and they want you spending your money at that cosmetic counter. Or then of course, then you see the dresses, and the guy stuff is all the way back in the corner, up on the second floor, right? Because they know we're going in and we're coming out. So they want us to go through there so that we can say, oh, wait, maybe I want to get my son, my sweetie something when I go home, right? That is by design. Because it's in this age that there are women with more disposable income than ever. Now, when you walk by a department store, and it's kind of hard now with the malls today, but if you were walking down Fifth Avenue, New York, or Michigan Avenue, Chicago, or Canal Street, New Orleans, what attracts you to the store? What makes you want to go in there?
The displays on the house, the window displays.
Right, window displays, right? Okay, you see this guy right there? His industry, his profession was window displays. You actually hired people to create window displays. And John Wanamaker in Philadelphia hired this fellow by the name of Louis Frank Baum to create his window displays. So you have the models doing all that kind of stuff and the dresses, and he knew how to gussy it up. Would anybody know what Louis Frank Baum did when he wasn't fixing up glass for people to be attracted? He was a writer. What's that? What were you going to say, Ms. Fisher?
It was wrong.
Okay. All right. It's okay to be wrong. I got no problem with it. He was a writer. L. Frank Baum, he went by. Anybody know his famous book? One of the most famous books in all of America.
Wizard of Oz.
The Wizard of Oz. Somebody looked it up on Google. Yes, he wrote The Wizard of Oz. And his main job was to create artwork in the glass displays. Now you understand where he comes from with Oz in many ways, because after all, the department store is nothing more than Oz itself, right? An emerald city of sorts. All right, now here's a cartoon, and political cartoons I really enjoy a great deal, and I'll show you plenty of them. This shows how big Standard Oil had become. Notice how it wraps its tentacles around state governments and the national government, and got its tentacle on the White House and everything, chewing up the politicians. This magazine that it comes from is a magazine called Puck Magazine, which is a very irreverent political satire magazine. This is the main hall at Wanamaker's store in Philadelphia. I mean, look at that. There's a sense of grandness there, right? Sense of power. It's like Oz, isn't it? That is a young Andrew Carnegie on the left when he's just beginning to get into U.S. Steel. On the right, you see John Rockefeller, who was really sort of an irascible old man. But he's sitting in a courtroom, and the judge who is talking to him while waving his glasses, that judge's name is Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And we will see him later. He will become the first commissioner of Major League Baseball, and he will be the one who will create the color line in baseball that will not be crossed until Jackie Robinson comes about. But this trial was about the breakup of Standard Oil. Now, here are some of the major robber barons in U.S. history. And I just wanted to point out a couple of them, these 8. This is Marshall Field in the upper left. Marshall Field has got the big store in Chicago. Jay Cooke, he was a financier. Jay Cooke is the man that basically helped the North win the Civil War financially. He sold the bonds that financed the Civil War government and basically allowed the American people afterwards to pay off the debt. This is James Buchanan Duke of the tobacco industry of North Carolina. Guess what's named after him? They play basketball there sometimes. This is Jay Gould. What's that? I'm sorry. And by the way, Mr. Duke was such a ruthless guy. They nicknamed him the Blue Devil.
Yeah, so I thought Duke University.
Duke University, Duke Energy, yeah. This is Jay Gould, who was a railroad and an opponent of Vanderbilt, who always would lose in business to Vanderbilt, but always managed to insult Vanderbilt in public and get Vanderbilt to get angry and pissed off at him. This is Charles Schwab, like Schwab Investments that you see on TV. He created Bethlehem Steel and later created an investment company. This is Charles Tyson Yerkes. He built the Chicago L, the elevated train, and also the London Railway. This is William Randolph Hearst of Hearst Publishing, the great empire of newspapers. And it's on him that the movie Citizen Kane is based. By the way, has anybody seen Mank on Netflix? You got to watch Mank, M-A-N-K, with Gary Oldman. You'll really enjoy it. And last but not least, Andrew Mellon, who together with Carnegie endowed a university in Pittsburgh called Carnegie Mellon University. And he was a steel magnate as well. And these are just some of the people who are known as the captains of industry or robber barons. They're all white men. Well, you've got the entrepreneurial spirit, you've got the captains of industry, you've got the financiers, you've got the inventors, but you also have another ingredient in big business, and that is you have a very, very good labor force. And labor force was really helped by the fact that we had very strong immigration in the years and the decades after the Civil War. Great deal of immigration is coming from Europe. Now, remember that there's a change in the post-Civil War era. You're going from the shop, which maybe had 20 people, 30 people at the most, and very rarely, on average, the average was around 10, to the factory. The factory is bigger, right? The factory is more impersonal. In the factory, you're just a cog in the machine. In the shop, you have a little more of a community sense, a little togetherness. So you're losing something by going from the shop to the factory. In addition, remember how I talked about the clock with the railroads being the model for big business? Well, you also had a change in the pace and control of work. Now, when in the early 1800s, you owned your own shop, when did work start? Whenever you damn well wanted it to start. That's when it started. Oh, I'm going to open up today. You know, you wanted to keep regular hours, but, you know, sometimes you had to go run and close the shop, go away, go do something. I work a little later today. I'll close up a little early today. Then you move from your, you know, mom and pop operation to a shop that has, you know, the average 10 workers in it. And you say, all right, well, now we have to maintain certain hours and so forth. But again, you're still largely the master of your time. When you move to the factory, and now it's when the whistle blows, you go into the factory. When do you quit? When that whistle blows again. That's when you quit. So you're not the master of your labor anymore. You don't have as much control over your labor as you used to. The labor sources, I've already talked about this. Former agricultural workers, people moving off of the farms, moving into cities because the industries in cities were very, very attractive. And you had immigrants. You have a steady supply of immigration. Immigration is the lifeblood of the American business ethic in this country. Really 8:45? Goodness gracious, I need to take a break. Let me finish this slide and then we'll take a break, okay? You also had piecework. This is the way industry, large industry, can spread around the homes. You give homes jobs to do as well in the industry, like sewing sleeves for shirts in the garment making industry, or doing small little machines on the side where you can go home and do the work. And this way you get a variety of clothing. You get, you allow people to have outside income at home. You get wives involved with their husbands. But these workers start to create, as you have less specialization of labor, those who had specialized labor now create what are known as craft unions and trade unions. You know, the United Sheet Metal Workers of the world, or the coal miners of the world. Okay, you have these unions that are there to say, okay, you know, we don't have as much control over our wages and our time and our conditions, but we're going to take some of that back. We're going to exercise some control over our work and our conditions and our pay. And so you had the growth of unions, which butt heads all the time with business ownership, with capital. You have labor, and the unions are the way in which you negotiate with capital. The leader, one of the leaders of this, is Mary Harris Jones, better known as Mother Jones. Mother Jones was a refugee from Ireland. She left in the wake of the Great Hunger when the potato crop failed. Many people call it a famine. That's wrong. Do not call it a famine. There was plenty of food in Ireland. It just simply was sitting in barns waiting to be shipped to other people by the British government while Irish were starving. All right, now I'm off the soapbox. She lost her husband and 4 children to yellow fever. All the children were under the age of 5, by the way. Talk about really devastation. She lost her dress shop in the Chicago fire of 1871, 5 years later. And that was a seminal turning point for her. You know, some people could sink into despair. Mother Jones decided, you know what? Screw that. I'm going to become an advocate for the children that still survive. And so she fought the exploitation of children her whole life in factories. She created, and that's her right there, doughty little woman. Okay. She helped William Silvis create the National Labor Union. She helped Terence Powderly create the Knights of Labor. She marched children who worked in factories to the home of Theodore Roosevelt in Oyster Bay, New York, on Long Island, called the March of the Mill Children, and had the children hold their hands up to show the fingers that they had lost in the industry. Roosevelt didn't come out to meet her. She helped create the United Mine Workers in West Virginia and became the chief negotiator for the United Mine Workers in their war against the state of West Virginia and the militia. She was one time called the most dangerous woman in America. There's a song that refers to her. And it comes from the United Mine Workers when she would come on the train. You know it?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, my wife. I thought my wife was saying she knows it. Anybody know that song? You've heard it. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. She'll be coming around the mountain. She'll be coming around the mountain. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes.
All right, give him a break.
My wife's telling me to give him a break. That song refers to her because they're saying she's coming, and she was just a little sprite of an Irish woman, but you didn't mess with her. The other great labor movement is considered to be sort of the umbrella corporation of most labor unions. It's called the American Federation of Labor. And it was formed by a cigar maker who emigrated from England the Netherlands via England, a Jewish cigar maker's son named Samuel Gompers. This is known as the AFL. And the AFL becomes the organizing union for all the other unions. So all the little unions now adopt the AFL in order to, excuse me, so I'm just doing something here. The AFL becomes the organizing union for all the other little unions. And so you'll go to many businesses and you'll see the gear that says AFL-CIO. That's it. Now, Gompers is not the only organizer of the AFL. He also has a fellow by the name of Michael Pierce, another Irishman, who helps organize it. So these are the people that will fight for bringing an end to child labor, workers' rights, better pay, things like that. And when they came around, people started to go, oh, here they come, look out. All right, let's all take a 10-minute break, shall we? It's 8:50. Let's come back at 9 o'clock. We'll go as far as we can to 9:30. I promise you, we never go past 9:30. I'm sure some of us have to go to the restroom. I'm one of them. So I will mute myself and I will see you all in 10 minutes.
Professor, can you leave up the last slide while we're on break? I have to finish writing the last few things at the bottom.
I would be delighted to, Ms. Parker.
Thank you. Hey, Shawanda.
Chanel, when I saw your name on the email, I kept going back over. I said, I wonder if that's the same Chanel.
I just told my son, I looked, I go, Shawanda in this class. He talk about who Shawanda is. I said, that's my friend from Holy Ghost.
Majoring in.
Girl, go sit down. You ain't never go to Holy Ghost, girl. Go, honesty. Girl, go. Girl, I can't stand it. That's Holy Cross, honesty. You went on the campus, girl. I can't do it. You sure?
Wait, what you majoring in here?
Education.
Oh, you still about to finish a degree in here? I thought you
Mhm.
finished. What you getting your master's?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's what's up. I used to work with another one of my friends,
Me?
Kendall Baldwin.
Oh, yeah. That's my girl.
Yeah.
Her baby and honesty are a day apart.
Oh, for real? Which one? Blake?
No, the Reese.
Reese. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh-huh,
Dang, I
yeah.
didn't know. I didn't see
Yeah,
that.
we
Oh,
were
dang, I
we
didn't
were
know that.
pregnant together. You know my husband DJ her wedding. I saw you there.
Yeah,
Go
yeah.
upstairs. Good night. School in the morning. Good day.
I didn't
Yeah.
know. That's so nice. Wait till I tell her.
I couldn't do it. They're like, we'll just be done now.
All right, everybody back? Excellent. So, moving along. Let's turn the attention into politics as the age of spoils and unrest, the industrial age and the age in which you have so much money and wealth is going to attract political aspects as well. And this is a time in which the political parties really come of age. And here you see the another Puck cartoon showing the Republican as the elephants, the Democrats as a donkey in sheep's clothing, so to speak. This is a cartoonist by the name of Thomas Nast, who is well known for a good number of cartoons, especially anti-Irish cartoons as well. You're going to hear a lot about the Irish in my class. I'm sorry if that gets to be too much after a while. All right, so political parties. Now, of course, in today's day and age, you have the political primary season or the caucuses. Each state will then select its delegates to go to the conventions. But in this time, in the 19th century, you didn't have all those primaries. And so you didn't have New Hampshire and Iowa and South Carolina and Super Tuesday and all that kind of stuff. You just simply had the party conventions. The delegates were chosen by the states, and the state conventions, they went and chose the presidential nominee from the party. And they were raucous events. They were largely unscripted, unlike today's party conventions, which are highly choreographed, highly scripted, very much a show. A lot is going on at these party conventions every 4 years. You also had a number of party platforms. Each platform had its planks, and you would fight over what you're going to put into your party platform each time. The other thing is that the political parties also gave out a great deal of patronage. You go out and work for me. You work to make me the president of the United States or the senator. I promise you, you're going to have a job. You have a job doing something. I promise you that. That's patronage right there. You give jobs to political support. I may have talked about it last week, but let me reaffirm it. This is how politics was done. You went out and knocked on doors and handed out flyers, and you said, vote for this guy and vote for that guy. And you put your name out there and you said, look, Mr. So-and-so, I've been working really hard for you. I want this job. And the candidate would say, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, you qualified for it, and I'm going to give it to you. Oh, you're not qualified for that job. Well, let me find a job that you can do. And sometimes this caused disappointment. Other times people were fulfilled in what they were looking for. It's how it works today. And those that went around giving out the jobs, they're called spoilsmen. They are the ones that will say, okay, you were working hard for candidate A, candidate A won, I'm representing candidate A. Guess what? You're now the assistant dog catcher for your precinct in this town. Or your mother now has a job working downtown at City Hall in this person's office. That's politics, folks. It's been politics since the time of Jesus and before that. The Romans operated on this. So now we see how the parties would operate. Let's take a look at each one of the parties. Let's look at the Republicans. The Republicans had a very effective campaign tactic when they ran for office, because many of the Republicans, remember that they are, a lot of them supported the Union during the Civil War. Most of them supported the Union during the Civil War, and even fought in the Union Army during the Civil War. And so they engaged in a practice known as waving the bloody shirt. They would hold up a shirt that was stained with blood and say, "This is my price. This is my love for America. I did this. I gave part of myself for my country." That was a very effective campaign tactic. And people still wave the bloody shirt today. Remember that. When you have veterans that run, Dan Crenshaw could easily, from Texas, could easily have an eye, a false eye. No, he goes around with the patch on his eye, right? Why? He lost his eye in combat. Republican Party demographics, largely Protestants, American Protestants, a large number of African Americans. 95% of the Republican Party, or 95%, I'm going to get the word out properly. 95% of African Americans are Republicans. After all, this is the party of Lincoln. This is the party of abolition. This is the party that fought for the Union, that gave the Emancipation Proclamation, that helped pass the 13th Amendment. Today, the demographic is completely flipped. 95% of African Americans are dyed-in-the-wool Democrats. How did that change? We will get to that, I promise you. The Republicans even created an organization called the Grand Army of the Republic. It's the forerunner of the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. It's Civil War veterans, Union soldiers, organized into lodges or chapters or divisions where they can go and they can tell war stories and drink beers and hear political candidates come and talk to them. It's a political organization through and through, disguised as a fraternal soldiers organization. And it is the forerunner of the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Marine Corps League, Military Order of the Purple Heart, you name it. And what about the Democrats? Now, the Democrats were not at all afraid to wave the bloody shirt themselves, especially in southern state governments. Case in point, Governor Francis T.U. Nichols, Governor Nichols of Louisiana. Nichols lost his arm in the Civil War. Well, in everyday life, Nichols wore a nice tailored suit, had a nice prosthetic arm, looked like a normal guy. Around campaign season, however, Nichols suddenly forgot his suit and forgot his arm and was dressed up in his Confederate uniform with his sleeve pinned up to show that he had lost an arm. The Democratic platform was anti-government. After all, government, especially in the South, was trying to enforce civil rights. They were anti-prohibition as well, whereas Republicans were very much in favor of prohibition. Democrats are against prohibition because the large demographic of the Democratic Party is beginning to change. It's becoming more immigrant-oriented, more Irish immigrant-oriented, but also more German immigrant-oriented. And they're Catholics. And Catholics don't mind a wee nip of the creature every now and then. They're not for ending alcoholic consumption. There's a strong immigrant faction in the Democratic Party. You're starting to see the Democratic Party shift away from the Southern whites who controlled it for time immemorial, and now it's becoming more and more an instrument of Northern immigrants non-native born Americans. Now, this age of spoils and unrest, obviously it's going to lead to, from time to time, the wrong people in the wrong jobs, or corrupt people in the jobs. And so what happens is that you get a large number of political scandals and corruption. For instance, Credit Mobilier. You build the Transcontinental Railroad, but what you do is you create a finance company to finance the Transcontinental Railroad. And there was a French finance company called Credit Mobilier that they brought over to the country, and they let this be the holding company for all the money that was going to build the Transcontinental Railroad. There's a hell of a lot of money there. It's attractive to a lot of people who are, shall we say, less than people of integrity. And so when certain payments are made out of Credit Mobilier to people that either did not do any work or did bad work, that's a scandal. In New York City, you have this man here, William Marcy Tweed, called Boss Tweed. He is in control of the New York Democratic political organization known as Tammany Hall. William Marcy Tweed was one of the most corrupt men ever to be the mayor of New York. And his organization held an iron fist over New York politics until he was charged and convicted of corruption and sent to prison. And eventually got out and then went to Europe where he died. But he was symbolic of the quintessential political machine, politics. Then one of my favorites is the whiskey ring. Now, what the whiskey ring involved was the diversion of tax revenue from alcoholic spirits, okay? Because remember, alcohol, you have special taxes on that because it is considered to be a vice. So you have vice taxes or sin taxes. But the tax revenues are diverted among government agents and politicians, whiskey distillers and distributors. You had a network of bribes sent around. Government officials were bribed. They were bribed so that the distillers could look the other way. Whiskey was supposed to be taxed at 70 cents per gallon, but instead they would pay the officials 35 cents per gallon, and then they would stamp the whiskey as having the tax paid, and then they would give bribes to the government officials to look the other way. Before they were caught, millions of dollars, which translates into billions of dollars today, siphoned off from federal taxes that should have gone into the federal treasury. And all of these undermined the Grant administration. Although Grant himself was never personally involved in this, it happened on his watch. And so it stained his administration. And it gives people later on, like Dunning, the ammunition to say, you see, it's nothing but bribery and corruption during Reconstruction. Now, there's answers to corruption and there's answers to politics, that where politics gets to be a little too prevalent. Well, there's the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, what we just call them the Grange. And this is an organization of farmers in order to lobby Congress for better prices and better controls on agricultural products. You also had those who were called greenbackers. Greenbackers are supporters of the farmers because farmers are always short on cash. They want more cash in circulation. Well, in the United States, we were at the time on the gold standard. That meant for every dollar you had out there, you had to have a dollar in the treasury to back it up. Greenbackers say that leads to a limited amount of money out there. We need to have money out there that's going to be in the hands of the right people so they can spend it. To which many people say, well, that's going to cause rampant inflation. Maybe, but the inflation takes care of itself when people put the money back into the economy, which is sort of the argument people are doing right now regarding that $2,000 stimulus check. Others asked for a graduated income tax. Remember, there's no income tax, federal income tax at this time. You have to have another amendment to the Constitution to create that. In 1877, the Great Railway Strike, I'm going to get it out of me, happens in 1877. And workers on the railroads go on strike all throughout the country. And it shows the effectiveness of strikes. They go on strike for wages, for better hours, and so forth. What happens in 1877 that makes this strike so unique is that the federal government will actually bring in troops, federal troops, to suppress the strikes. They will use the power of the federal government will come down on the side of capital, the business ownership, to break up strikes. It shows you how well the robber barons, the captains of industry, had managed to gain control of the levers of government. That they're actually able to make the federal government call in federal troops to break up strikes. Now, about a year and a half ago, this fellow would have been far more interesting than he is now, but nonetheless, I'm going to point him out. His name is John Brooks Henderson, and John Brooks Henderson was brought in to investigate the whiskey ring. He is the first special counsel. Remember how Robert Mueller was the special counsel that investigated the previous president? Well, he's the first special counsel. And he was fired by President Grant because he tried to keep President Grant from interfering with the investigation because his brother-in-law was involved with the whiskey ring. So even though Grant himself wasn't involved with the whiskey ring, his brother-in-law, Frederick Dent, was. And he had to try and get his brother-in-law out of the way, and this prosecutor was getting in the way. So before there was Robert Mueller, there was John Brooks Henderson. Okay, so we've taken a look at business, taking a look at politics, but now let's take a look at U.S. foreign policy from 1877. Now, it is largely reported and told in the textbooks and so forth that the United States was an isolationist country during this time. And that's not exactly true. The United States was very much involved in world affairs and had a very strong foreign policy. We simply didn't get involved with other nations and their foreign policies at the time, unless they, crossed paths with our interests. The United States makes a number of deals with foreign nations, a number of initiatives with foreign nations, some successes, some failures. We purchased Alaska in 1867. Many people call this Seward's folly because this was William H. Seward, the Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. He actually stayed loyal to the administration. At one time thought he would be the president of the United States. And Seward was one of those that was wounded in the assassination attempt on Lincoln because another guy went to his house and tried to assassinate him. He survived and he purchased Alaska. Many people say you're purchasing a big hunk of ice with nothing but Eskimos and reindeer. What we didn't realize is that there was a lake of oil on there and Sarah Palin. But I digress. The big thing was the oil and the gold that would be found even before the oil. During the Civil War, the British government granted the Confederacy belligerency status. That didn't mean they recognized the Confederacy diplomatically, but they did recognize them as a fighting power. And this was an abrogation of the treaty that they had signed with the United States back in 1818, called the Convention of 1818. Well, we sued the British government and wrote out a new treaty. And in it, an independent international court ruled that Britain was wrong, that Britain abrogated the terms of the treaty. And so they paid us $15.5 million and wrote a new treaty, the Treaty of Washington. And the man who negotiated the treaty was Ulysses S. Grant's Secretary of State, this man right here, Hamilton Fish. He is considered to be one of the best secretaries of state we have ever had. He is really the model of the foreign policy guru Secretary of State. A man that was well-versed in diplomacy. He was one of those guys that was very soft-spoken, and yet he had a spine of absolute steel. And when he would not move on something, you didn't move him. And he's the one that negotiated the Treaty of Washington. And why is that important? Because remember that from the Revolution all the way to the Civil War, the United States and Britain were not friendly with each other. They were rivals. There was a Cold War between the US and Great Britain. Today, what do we have? We have a very special relationship with Great Britain, right? That's the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. We love the British. In fact, Americans like that royal family even more than the British do. That's how special the relationship is, but especially in government and politics and so forth. Well, this is one of the steps forward in the warming of relations between the United States and Britain. And then you'll have the two world wars that'll really cement our relationship together. Our nearest neighbors, of course, live in Latin America. And the United States always has its eye on Latin America, the Caribbean, Mexico, South America. And remember that what is our guiding policy toward the Western Hemisphere? What is American foreign policy and what is American policy toward the Western Hemisphere? What do we adhere to? This is basic social studies 101, US history. What did we issue in 1823 that says what the US is in relation to all the countries of the Western Hemisphere? Come on.
Allies?
Say again?
Allies?
I can't hear you, Jasmine. It's you're coming in kind of staticky.
Oh, I was saying allies, like friends.
Okay, we do have allies and so forth, but what is our guiding principle toward those countries in the Western Hemisphere?
Isn't it spreading democracy?
Say again, Chase?
Like spreading democracy?
Well, yeah, we definitely want to spread democracy, our kind of democracy, yeah. Anybody ever hear of the Monroe Doctrine? Oh, yeah. What is the Monroe Doctrine? I'm going to give you the Monroe Doctrine, very simple. The United States is the big brother to the Western Hemisphere. The countries of Latin America, Mexico, the Caribbean, South America, are no longer open to any more European colonization. No more Europeans can come over and colonize. And if there is a European colony over there, like run by Spain or Portugal or France or Britain or so forth, and they go into revolution, that country has to stay out. Let the country figure it out on their own. That is the Monroe Doctrine. Now, keep something in mind. It is not a law. The Monroe Doctrine is not a law. It is simply a statement of foreign policy that James Monroe and John Quincy Adams worked out. Furthermore, the United States did not have the strength or the power to actually enforce the Monroe Doctrine for a long time because we didn't have a big army and we didn't have a big navy. We don't like that. We're the Americans. We don't do that sort of thing. But the British said, oh, I say, that's a rather good policy for us too. So the British Navy enforced the Monroe Doctrine for us up until the First World War. Nonetheless, there is a little problem with European interference in Latin America. See, while the Americans were fighting the Civil War, the French had this great idea that they were going to land their troops in Mexico, and they were going to take the younger brother of the Emperor of Austria named Maximilian and put him on the throne of Mexico, and they did that. At a certain point, the Americans start saying, well, this is a violation of our Monroe Doctrine. We have to do something about that. And eventually the Mexicans themselves do something about it. They win this big battle at Puebla on the, you guessed it, the 5th of May, Cinco de Mayo, and run the French out, and then they capture Maximilian and they execute him. So the Austrian emperor loses his little brother. Seward didn't want to just purchase Alaska. He also wanted to purchase bases in the Dominican Republic today. We call it back then Santo Domingo, and the Danish West Indies. And the American Congress said, no, we don't want to do that. He said, well, you let us purchase Alaska. Why can't we purchase the Santo Domingo and the Danish West Indies? Too many dark colored people down there. Race is the guiding principle of American foreign policy at this time. Keep that in mind. And I'm not just supposing this, I'm not guessing at this. This is actually part of the congressional record, where congressmen stand up and say, no, we do not want white America being diluted by bringing in more Black Caribbeaners, period. And thus we could not get those bases in the Caribbean. It's one of the reasons why Cuba is not an American state to this day. It was several times we wanted to take Cuba and to purchase Cuba. And every time we said, no, too many blacks, we don't want that. That was said in the halls of Congress. The third area that deserves mention is, of course, the Pacific and East Asia. And the big area, of course, is China. China represents the area that has at the time, 500 million people. Think of all the things that we can sell to those Chinese coming from America, from our big industries. It's a big market, that China. In order to get access to China, we also have to have good relations with Japan and Korea. We had opened up Japan in 1853. Korea, which is right next to China, we had to go with them. And then there's the curious case of Hawaii, and why Hawaii is an American possession and an American state to this day. In 1893, we wanted to get Hawaii. And once again, the folks in Congress said, guess what? Sorry, too many non-white people there. And we just don't want to dilute white America with this. 5 years later, we purchased Hawaii. And how is it that this happened? Very simply, the pineapple growers of Hawaii, the plantation owners led by Klaus Spreckels, said that the white population on Hawaii was in danger of being, quote unquote, overrun and overwhelmed by the non-white population of Hawaii. Oh, well, in that case, we're going to go in and get Hawaii. And so in 1898, we will purchase Hawaii. And in 1959, it becomes an American state. And 2 years later, a young man with a Kenyan father and an Irish-American mother is born there, and he'll become president of the United States. What does all this amount to? Between 1877 and 1900, the United States is a nascent world power. That means it has the potential, and it could be a world power. It's an economic giant. We know that already. It has a merchant fleet that is the envy of the world. But it does not have a big navy, and it does not have a big army anymore. It demobilized everything after the Civil War, because Americans don't like large standing armies, and our Navy was, well, Our Navy was built for the Civil War, and then it's decommissioned as well. But we have the potential to be a world power, a player on the world stage. But we have two oceans protecting us from the rest of the world. We're quite happy to have an active and lively foreign policy and good trade relations with all the people of the world. But we're not really that interested at this point in, moving out. And yet that's going to change. Now, I wish I could go on till about midnight with you. You want to go to midnight? I could do midnight with you. No? Okay. Well, I know it was a tough decision, but I guess what we'll do is we'll call it a night. Now, what I didn't do, and I only have a minute left, is I really like to end class by asking you all to tell me one thing that you found the most compelling. And if I can do that in 1 minute or maybe two, if you grant me just a couple of minutes, maybe each of you could just very quickly share with me one thing that you found interesting that maybe you didn't realize before, or something that stuck out. So let's just go around the room and let's hear from Roxanne, Shawanda, Chase, Jasmine, and then Chanel. Okay. So Roxanne, you lead off.
You want me to go first?
Roxanne.
I can go first.
Okay,
Can you hear
Shawanda,
me?
you go ahead
I'll go
first.
first. So I found the Battle of Liberty Square that happened in New Orleans at the foot of Canal. I didn't know when they were taking down the monuments that was even a part of it.
Yep, that was part of it. That's why it was
So
there.
that stood out for me a lot.
Good. Thank you. I don't want to cut anybody off. If you got more to say, please. I do want you to keep it quick, but I don't want to cut you off at the same time. All right, back to you, Roxanne. Let's see if you can do it now.
Okay. Now I'll unmute it. I was talking, but I forgot to take the mute off. But actually, the same thing that she was just saying, I was surprised. I knew about the other monuments being named after specific people, but I never really knew what the significance was of that particular monument. That surprised me.
It was an active attempt by white New Orleanians to overthrow a fusion reconstruction government. Yep.
That I never knew that. And I'm 50 years old. Been here all my life.
You're young. All right, Chase.
I just find it I find it really interesting that really just about like the elections, the elections and stuff, and how much it does seem like I know we stated it last week, but like how much history kind of repeats itself almost multiple times, especially when it comes to something that I'm interested in. It's like the popular vote versus the electoral vote, which I've always thought was a problem, and it's continued to be a problem through history. Even just a few times, like with George W. Bush and between Greeley and Grant and everything. I mean, not Greeley and Grant, but the other one with Florida.
Tilden and Grant.
Yeah, Tilden.
Okay, good. Jasmine?
There was like a lot of interesting things tonight, but I liked hearing more about like J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, because like I've learned about them throughout the years, but it's like it just fascinates me how much of like a superpower they were, and also like reminded me of Monopoly a lot. And also I forgot her name, like I was trying to find her, but the lady who was helping the kids as far as like in the factories and stuff, I forgot her name. Mother
Jones.
Yeah, she's that's amazing. Like she just looked like such a wonderful woman from the picture you showed.
She was a formidable human being. There's a website called motherjones.com. You should go look at it. It's a very leftist news organization. They make a lot of appearances on MSNBC, by the way. You won't see them on Fox News. Let's just say that, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Parker.
Okay, the monument stood out to me. Also,
Chicago being the centerpiece of the railroad world, and also vertical integration, and just finding out information about McDonald's as far as them controlling everything and where they became their major business. Actually started from real estate. I didn't know that information.
Okay. Cool, cool. All right, just real quick to finish up, your primary source exercises are graded now, and I have put comments on them. Please take the time to read the comments and take the constructive criticism that is on there so that you can see some of the errors that were made. Everybody got full credit for turning it in. I'm not lowering the hammer just yet. I will let you know when I plan on lowering the hammer, but I do still want you to improve your writing. Make sure you answer the question as best as possible. I feel like I've lost some people on here because not everybody spoke. What happened to Miss Wynn? No, she left us, and Keanu. All right. Well, I'll worry about that when I have to worry about that. In the meantime, we're good. Thank you all very much. Thank you for giving me the extra 5 minutes. I know you're all probably tired. Tomorrow's already Thursday. Can you believe it? I'll let you go. Your next assignment should be popping up already. And if you have any questions about the film, let me know that too, okay? Have a good evening, folks.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Feel better, Mr. John.
Hope you
Thank you
feel
very
better.
Thank you.